Somewhere on a sugar plantation in Antigua, sometime in the 1890s, a plantation owner makes a decision that feels, in the moment, like simple common sense. His cane fields are being torn apart by rat stowaways that arrived by accident in the hulls of European cargo ships and have since multiplied into the thousands. Someone suggests a fix that's already catching on across the Caribbean. Bring in a predator, a small, sharp-toothed hunter from Asia called the mongoose. Turn it loose in the fields. Let it do the work. Problem solved. Nobody standing in that cane field that day understood they had just triggered a chain of extinction that would take more than a century to even partly undo. Because the mongoose was about to ignore the rats almost entirely and go hunting for something else instead. Something that had never needed to be afraid of anything that hunted in daylight. To understand exactly what was about to be lost, you have to go back further than the plantations, further than the ships, back to a version of these islands with no fences and no roads at all. Long before any European vessel reached the twin islands of Antigua and Barbuda, a slender, gray-brown snake called the Antiguan racer ruled the undergrowth. It's a strange animal to call a racer, despite the name. It isn't fast at all. It's an ambush hunter, patient almost to the point of stillness, burying most of its body under leaf litter and waiting, sometimes for hours, for a lizard to wander close enough to strike. It has no venom worth fearing, just a mild secretion in the back of its jaw, enough to subdue a lizard, harmless to a human hand. Males and females don't even look alike, one of the only snakes on Earth where you can tell the sexes apart at a glance by color alone. And across roughly 440 square kilometers of forest, scrub, and coastline, this quiet, patient, harmless animal sat at the very top of its own miniature food chain. Nothing on these islands had ever been built to hunt it. Then came the 1500s. And with them, sugarcane. Forests were cleared, plantations spread across both islands, and ships began arriving constantly from Europe, each one, unknowingly, a delivery vehicle for black rats hidden deep in the cargo holds. The rats tore into the sugarcane. They also, quietly, began eating racer eggs, one clutch at a time, in numbers nobody was tracking. By the late 1800s, the rat problem had become unmanageable, and that's when the mongooses arrived, the solution that would turn out to be the real disaster. Nobody who introduced them had checked one basic fact about the two species they were pitting against each other. Black rats are nocturnal. Mongooses hunt by day. The two barely cross paths at all. Instead, across daylight hours when the rats were safely asleep underground, the mongooses did exactly what a fast, sharp-toothed predator does best. They hunted everything else that moved slowly along the forest floor. Native ground-nesting birds, frogs, lizards, and a snake that had spent its entire evolutionary history with absolutely no reason to fear anything that hunted while the sun was up. Within 60 years, it was over. The racer vanished from mainland Antigua completely. It disappeared from Barbuda too, for reasons that still aren't fully understood even today. By 1936, officials had already declared the species extinct, erased in 2 human lifetimes by an animal that had been imported to solve a completely different problem, and had barely touched it. Except it wasn't quite gone. Roughly 2.5 kilometers off Antigua's northeast coast sits a scrap of land called Great Bird Island. It measures 8.4 hectares, smaller than most shopping mall parking lots, small enough to walk the entire coastline of in under half an hour, and by pure geographic accident, the mongooses never made it across that stretch of open water to reach it. In the 1960s, a handful of specimens turned up there, collected almost as an afterthought by passing naturalists. Another was confirmed in 1987. For decades, the story circulated only as a rumor among a small circle of local wildlife enthusiasts. The extinct racer might still be clinging on, in secret, on one forgotten island nobody official was watching. One of those enthusiasts was an Antiguan naturalist named Kevil Lindsay. In 1995, convinced the rumor was worth chasing properly, he made a call to Fauna and Flora International in the UK, asking for help before it was too late to matter. A team of conservation biologists flew out and spent 3 full months on Great Bird Island, running a proper mark recapture survey, walking the leaf litter at dawn and dusk, catching every single snake they could find, fitting each one with a tiny transponder, releasing it, and counting. The number they landed on was 51. That was it. The entire global population of the Antiguan racer standing on a single islet you could cross on foot in 20 minutes. And it got worse. More than half of the snakes examined were carrying injuries consistent with rat bites, torn tails, scarring, some barely healed, because even on this last refuge, Great Bird Island was still crawling with the same predator that had wiped the species out everywhere else on Earth. A snake that had ruled this ecosystem for longer than humans had walked it had been reduced to a wounded handful of survivors on one forgotten rock, and it was still being eaten alive in real time, while the biologists counted. The world's rarest snake had just been found, and it was actively dying. The team moved fast, working alongside the Antiguan Forestry Unit, the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, the Environmental Awareness Group, and researchers from Black Hills State University. They launched what became known as the Antiguan Racer Conservation Project. 6 organizations, one shared deadline. Their first move was almost embarrassingly simple: kill the rats before doing anything else. Picture it. 730 individual bait stations, laid out by hand across an island barely bigger than a few dozen football fields, each one holding a bittered block of wax, laced with a rodent-specific anticoagulant, engineered so that any bird or lizard that stumbled across it would ignore it completely, while a rat would eat it and nothing else. It took 7 days to eradicate the entire rat population of Great Bird Island. 7 days to undo a problem that had been running for over a century. The racer responded almost immediately. Within 18 months, the population had more than doubled. Seabird colonies, which had also been getting hammered by the same rats for generations, exploded back to life at the exact same time. Biologist Jenny Daltrey, who would go on to coordinate the project for years, later called it one of the fastest visible ecological reversals her team had ever documented on an island this size. For the first time in living memory, Great Bird Island had something close to its original ecosystem back, all from removing one animal. But success brought its own problem, almost immediately. Great Bird Island is tiny, and it simply didn't have enough lizards, the racer's only meaningful food source, to support a fast-growing snake population. By the late 1990s, roughly 1 in 5 racers on the island were underweight, some visibly thin, competing for a shrinking supply of prey on a rock that had nowhere left to expand into. The team had pulled the species back from the edge of extinction and immediately run headfirst into a smaller. At the same time, the project tried building a second safety net, just in case. In 1996, 5 adult racers, 3 females, 2 males, were flown across the Atlantic to Jersey Zoo in the UK, placed in the care of specialists at the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, as insurance against any single disaster that might wipe out the entire wild population in one stroke. Within the first year, 1 female laid 11 eggs. 5 hatched the first Antiguan racers ever bred in captivity, anywhere, in recorded history. It should have been a triumph. Instead, an outbreak of snake mites parasites that don't naturally exist anywhere in Antigua, and that the racers had zero evolved resistance to, tore through the captive colony almost as fast as the rats had once torn through the wild one. 9 of the 10 Jersey racers died. A parallel attempt at a zoo in New Jersey ended exactly the same way. The entire group lost within months. The lesson landed hard, and it landed on everyone involved. This snake could not simply be tucked away behind glass and kept safe by human hands. If it was going to survive at all, it needed real islands, in the real wild, cleared of the exact predators that had nearly finished it off a century earlier. If the idea of a species surviving on one 8.4-hectare rock, brought back from the edge of extinction by 7 days of work, sounds like a story you don't want to lose track of halfway through, that's exactly the kind of species this channel exists to follow. Go ahead and subscribe now, because what happens over the next 2 decades is where this story stops being a simple rescue and starts getting genuinely strange. With captive breeding ruled out for good, the team turned their attention to the other islands scattered around Antigua, 14 more Ks in total, and began systematically clearing them of rats and, wherever present, mongooses, one island at a time. Nothing was rushed. Each site was checked, cleared, monitored, and confirmed fully secure before a single snake was ever moved onto it. The first candidate was Rabbit Island. In November 1999, 10 wild racers, 5 females, 5 males, hand-selected from the healthiest segment of the Great Bird Island population, were carried across open water in secure containers and released into forest that hadn't held an Antiguan racer in over a century. They didn't just survive the move, they started breeding almost immediately, adjusting to unfamiliar terrain faster than anyone monitoring them had expected. 3 years later, in October 2002, it was Green Island's turn. 16 more racers were released into its dense coastal scrub, chosen for its abundant lizard population, and its elevation. Much of the island sits safely above 5 meters, a detail that mattered far more than anyone realized at the time. By 2005, field researchers were finding juvenile racers there for the first time. Born on the island rather than translocated to it, proof the new colony was now reproducing entirely on its own, with no further intervention needed. Then, in 2003 and 2004, the team made a move that doesn't usually make it into the highlight reel of a conservation success story, but mattered enormously. A second wave of translocations. 20 more snakes this time, 11 pulled from Great Bird Island, and 9 from the now thriving Rabbit Island colony, all funneled into reinforcing the populations that were still finding their footing. This wasn't a triumphant new chapter. It was quiet, unglamorous maintenance, the kind of unremarkable, repetitive work that almost never gets filmed, but is often the actual difference between a recovery that holds and one that quietly slides backward. The fourth and final release came in January 2008, on York Island. With that, the Antiguan racer's entire occupied territory had grown from a single 8.4-hectare rock to more than 63 hectares spread across 4 separate islands, roughly a 7-fold expansion of the only home this species had left anywhere on the planet. Through every stage of it, local staff like McRonnie Henry, then head of Antigua's forestry unit, spent years walking these same shorelines with a handheld radio antenna, tracking transponder-tagged snakes one faint signal at a time, building the field data, island by island, that eventually proved the whole reintroduction program was actually working, and not just surviving on hope. And the racer wasn't the only thing coming back. Every single island the team cleared of rats and mongooses showed the same ripple effect, almost like flipping a switch. Ground-nesting seabird colonies rebounded so sharply that some individual populations grew more than 30-fold within a few short years. The West Indian whistling duck and the Caribbean brown pelican, both species of regional conservation concern, began returning to these islands in numbers nobody on the project had predicted or planned for. Sea turtles resumed nesting on beaches the rats had been raiding for generations, their eggs finally left alone long enough to hatch. Rare native plants, no longer having their seedlings devoured before they could ever take root, began reappearing entirely on their own, with no replanting required. Back on the mainland, something else was shifting too, and it had nothing to do with rats or bait stations. Across the eastern Caribbean, old folklore around snakes runs deep. Many islanders grew up associating them with jumbies, malevolent spirits said to take animal form, and the instinct on spotting one, anyone, was simply to kill it on sight before it could do harm. Rather than fight that fear from a safe distance with pamphlets and press releases, the project walked straight into it. In 2001, they launched a program called Floating Classrooms, taking Antiguan schoolchildren out by boat to the offshore islands themselves, letting them hold a racer, harmless and gentle, coiled loosely in their own hands, and see it as part of their own natural heritage instead of something to fear and destroy. It worked, and it kept working. The snake made its way into the national school curriculum. The surrounding waters were formally protected as part of the Northeast Marine Management Area, and more than 3,000 hectares of coastline were placed under lasting protection as a direct result of the project's momentum. From 2010 onward, a Durrell Academy graduate named Natalia Lawrence took over coordinating the renamed Offshore Islands Conservation Program, steering a project that had started as one desperate attempt to save a single species into something far broader, a template for protecting an entire fragile island ecosystem at once. A species that had once been killed on sight anywhere it appeared had become, within a single generation, a genuine source of national pride, printed in school books, pointed out proudly to visiting tourists on the very same boat tours that once would have avoided the islands entirely. By 2016, the numbers told an almost unbelievable story. From 51 snakes on one wounded island in 1995, The Antiguan racers' population across its 4 islands had climbed past 1,200, more than a 20-fold recovery in roughly 2 decades. Fauna and flora noted something almost bittersweet buried inside that success. The Antiguan racer had grown so numerous, it had technically lost its grim, unwanted title. It was no longer the rarest snake in the world. That crown had quietly passed to a cousin species over on St. Lucia, and conservationists were now studying Antigua's exact playbook, hoping to repeat every step of it there, before that population ever fell as low as 50. 30 years after one phone call from one local naturalist who refused to let a rumor go unchecked. A species that had been officially declared extinct not once, but twice, was, by every measurable standard available to science, saved. Except numbers like that invite a dangerous kind of comfort. And in 2023, that comfort broke. That year, the Environmental Awareness Group carried out its regular 3-month census across all 4 islands, using the same painstaking mark and count method that had been standard since 1995, walking the leaf litter at dawn and dusk, island by island, counting every snake they could find by hand. What they found stunned people who had spent 3 decades of their working lives on this project. The population that had peaked above 1,200 in 2016 had collapsed to roughly 400. In just 7 years, the Antiguan racer had lost 2 out of every 3 individuals it had. There were no rats this time, no mongooses. The predators had been kept off every single island exactly as planned, exactly as they had been for 2 full decades. Conservationists on the ground, including the EAG's Cheryl Charles, point instead to rising regional temperatures, longer and harsher dry seasons, and a shrinking supply of fresh water and prey on islands that were never large to begin with, the same climate pressures now stacking up across the entire Caribbean basin, from Antigua to St. Lucia to islands with no conservation program watching them at all. Growing visitor traffic and development pressure on the offshore islands haven't helped either. In response, the EAG has since drawn up a formal conservation action plan built specifically around climate resilience, working with island landowners, local communities, and the national government to figure out what a rescue plan looks like when the threat isn't an animal you can simply remove with bait stations. The species that had already survived 100-year-old mistake made in good faith in a sugarcane field in the 1890s was now facing a second threat, one moving nearly 10 times faster than the first one ever did, and one with no single invasive predator you could point to, trap, and eradicate in 7 days. So is this a conservation triumph, or a warning wearing a triumph's clothing? One camp argues the last 3 decades prove exactly what focused, science-led intervention can achieve, that without the rat eradication and the careful island-by-island reintroductions, this snake simply would not exist in any form today, full stop, and that Antigua's exact methods are already being adapted right now to save St. Lucia's racer, before its population ever falls as low as 50. From this angle, even the 2023 crash isn't a failure of the program. It's a new problem the program bought 30 extra years to even discover and respond to, years the species would never have had otherwise. The other camp looks at those same numbers from 2023 and sees something more uncomfortable. Proof that removing the predators was never the whole fix, that a species squeezed onto a handful of hectares with almost no genetic diversity left. Some racers today are already showing physical signs consistent with inbreeding. From stubby, damaged-looking tails to weaker disease resistance was always one bad decade away from collapsing again, no matter how good the intervention looked on paper in 2016. From this angle, the real danger in every rewilding headline, every back from extinction story, is convincing the public that the work is finished, when for a species this fragile, on islands this small, it never actually is, and never will be. Somewhere on that same 8.4-hectare islet where this whole story started, teams from the Environmental Awareness Group are still out walking the leaf litter today, still counting, still tagging. 30 years after the first survey found 51 snakes clinging to survival on one forgotten cay. Nobody official even knew to check. The title of World's Rarest Snake has already changed hands once, because of what happened on this stretch of Caribbean coastline. Nobody currently working on Great Bird Island will tell you with any certainty that it isn't about to change hands again this time. Back. One bad decision, made with good intentions in a cane field in the 1890s, took 60 years to finish a species off. It took 30 more years of slow, patient, largely unfilmed work bait stations and boat trips and school children holding harmless snakes for the first time to undo. And now the same small islands that gave this snake back its future are quietly asking a harder question than the one they started with 3 decades ago. Not whether a species like this can be saved. They already proved that it can. The question now is whether being saved once is ever really the end of the story, or just the part of it we chose to stop watching.